All right. So my name is Maisie, and I am the manager of education and innovation. And today in our recording, we will be hearing from Max and Michelle Marty, a mother and son duo who have been navigating the world of tube feeding and infusing for about 13 years, most of his life, 14 now, I think he had a birthday, as well as Carol Cheney, who is a staff nurse at the Children's Hospital at Harvard. We're also going to hear from a longtime Oley member who is now a staff member, Mary Wooten, whose daughter is tube fed and whose experiences sort of inspired this specific topic, but it's applicable to so many. So it's important that we start talking about it. Carol mentions a couple of resources throughout, so I'm going to try to share those and make those accessible as she does. And I also realized these particular speakers talk a lot about accommodations at school, a little bit in the workplace, but if you have any questions specifically about managing these sorts of things at work, please feel free to drop your questions and maybe Carol will answer them or we can find you some additional resources afterwards. So don't let that deter you. So without any further delay, I will turn the floor over to Mary.
Thank you, Maisie. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending and celebrating the second day of Feeding Tube Awareness Week with us. As Maisie said, my name is Mary Wooten, and I'm member coordinator here at the Oley Foundation, and I'm mom to Natalie. She's 14 years old, and she's had a feeding tube since age 16 months due to dysmotility and feeding issues. Tube feeding in school has always been a challenge for us. Being asked to bolus feed in the bathroom by a teacher who was inexperienced with Natalie, to being refused an aid because nutrition isn't important to learning, they said, down to another teacher not allowing time for Natalie to hook up to her feeds, and right up to the most recent incident where a hall monitor thought that she was breaking the no book bags rule and tried to pull her book bag off her shoulder and then brought her down to the principal's office for breaking the no backpack rule because he didn't believe her that she was allowed to have her backpack for medical purposes. Thankfully, Natalie was able to advocate and stand up for herself in those instances. But with each new challenge, we learn how to better navigate the system to fit Natalie's needs to help her be as successful as she can be. I hope that this webinar provides you with the tools and information needed to help you successfully navigate your workplace and school and to advocate for yourself or your loved one in those settings. Now we'll hear from our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And I'm sure you and Natalie are not alone in those challenging experiences of not being understood or being completely invalidated. So give me one moment while I pull up our speakers. And I was saying at the beginning, I am great with technology until I have to be, and then nothing seems to go right. So we will see. And do bear with us in terms of the audio quality. I hope it comes through okay, but please do use the question and answer box to let me know if it's not as well. All right, without further ado. Oh no. Hold on one moment. Thank you for your patience. My goodness, nothing seems to be working. Oh, gosh. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Like I said, we should expect this. Oh man. Hold on one moment. This is embarrassing. um, Andrea or Kathy, it is accessible in the Dropbox. If one of you could try to pull it up that way while I try to navigate my computer, that would be super helpful. I just don't want to take up any more of these folks' time. Thank you, Mary. I appreciate you. We do have a ton of events happening this week for Feeding Tube Awareness Week. I am so sorry, you guys. This is so embarrassing. My computer is having a meltdown. Oh, here we go. Okay. Well, this isn't ideal, but hold on one moment. I think it might be working for me. People are using the Q&A to answer, which is awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for your patience, you guys. Never quite seems to go as planned, does it? All right. I think we are hopefully okay. Mary, can you just give me a shout in the chat if you can see that video?
I can see it, Maisie.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Again, I so apologize for the delay. It's never quite works on the first go. All right, so I will be quiet and show the recording. All right, so the topic of this webinar is tube feeding at work and school, being hooked up at work and school, and anywhere else life may take you. Today we have the honor of listening to Max Marty, who is an amazing 13-year-old living with a G-tube and a central line that he'll tell us more about. And he's going to talk about how he's navigated being hooked up, going to school, and living a very busy life, despite whatever medical complexities he might be dealing with. We also have his incredible mom, Michelle, who's been a fierce advocate for him and taught him how to advocate for himself as well. And Carol, one of his wonderful staff nurses, who helped them put pieces in place to ensure Max would be safe while hooked up at school. So we're going to talk a little bit about those things and how they have navigated that in their life. So do you guys want to, Michelle and Max, do you want to take a moment and introduce yourselves?
Sure. So I'm Max Marty. I'm 13 years old. I have one twin brother and two sisters. And right now I'm doing many after-school activities, including music, theater, sports, and stuff like that.
Awesome.
And I'm Max's mom. And I have twin sons and two daughters, like he just said. And we've been on this journey together since his birth, and we've learned a lot together. So looking forward to talking about it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll talk a little bit more about Max's diagnosis and why he has those things. But first, Carol, would you like to introduce yourself and why you're here?
Sure. So I'm Carol. I'm actually staff nurse for the Center for Advanced Intestinal Rehabilitation program at Boston Children's Hospital and have been a nurse in infusion and specifically nutrition support for about 30 years. So prior to coming to Boston Children's, I actually worked in the home setting for about 25 years.
Excellent. Thank you. Lots of experience in these squares, which is amazing. So Max, do you mind talking a little bit about what medical devices you do have and maybe why you have them?
So I have a central line and a G2 because I have Hirschsprung's disease and short bowel syndrome. Sorry. And I have the central line so I can get TPN at night, and I have the G-tube so I can take meds and feeds throughout the day.
Awesome. And you were born with it, you said, right?
Yes.
Mhm. So how, I guess we can dive right in. When you were getting ready to go to school, and Michelle and Carol, feel free to chime in, what steps did you take? What procedures, protocols were in place? Who did you communicate with? I'm assuming we didn't just send him off into the fray and hope for the best. So what steps did you folks take to make sure he was safe at school, hooked up?
So he was in a preschool program, and I was terrified to send him to kindergarten because of germs, and it was like the Wild West. And I knew he was going to be hooked up during those days. Him and his twin both have the same diagnosis, but different medical situation a little bit. And the director of the preschool told me that I'd be disservicing them if I kept them home and homeschooled them because they're so social and so intelligent. So I had to brave it and go ahead to the public school system. And that entailed getting a 504. So I had to request a 504, which is a plan, a legally placed plan, which will make medical accommodations for your child. And I requested that. They came out, the administrators came out to observe Max on the playground, and they denied me the 504 because they said he doesn't need any medical care. We saw him on the playground. He was not hooked up at that time. He's a normal kid running around. He's fine. And I had this stack of paper from Boston Children's and doctors and surgeries and everything. So it was a process, and we fought to get a one-on-one nurse with him in school because he would be infusing in a very large elementary school in a city that we lived in, where there were lots and lots of medical issues and behavioral issues. Come to find out, budget was an issue, which is why there was pushback for getting a one-on-one nurse. A little bit of ego was also involved, and it was with the nurse that was in charge, and it was just a little bit of navigating the players and trying to come across as a team player, because that's what you want. You want everybody to be on the same team because we're all working to make it the best experience and the safest experience for the children, but also not backing down from what you know your child needs. And so we fought and fought, and Carol, actually, we knew Carol at the time. She came down and spoke at one of our meetings. We ended up having to get an attorney, and they finally gave us a one-on-one nurse. But the entire year, 2 years that we were in that school district, it was a constant battle because the nursing wasn't sufficient, it wasn't reliable. So we ended up moving school districts. And what a difference just moving 10 minutes away to a different school district. When I explained the situation to them, they went above and beyond, giving us everything we needed. So it really depended on the school district and what their budget constraints were. And I realized it wasn't personal per se, and it wasn't necessarily about, what we did or didn't need. It was what they could provide or not provide, and what pressures they were being faced behind the scenes. So it was very interesting to learn that. And I think that's important for parents to know, because you go in there fighting for your kids and you think these people are fighting against you, and it's not always just against you. So anyway, long story short, we got them into an amazing public school system where we are now, and they hired a nurse for them who is like, some people have referred to her as like their school mom, because she really does everything for them at school. And so that's how that went about. It was not easy. It was very, very complicated. And I had tons of support from our medical team. And that's really important too. And then I guess I'd reiterate the other part is the advice I was given is go in as a team player. You're not fighting against these people. You want everyone to kind of work with you for the best. which is hard to do.
Absolutely. Like you said, you want the best for your child, and it doesn't always feel like that's the common goal, but you're right.
Yeah, the mama bear
Yep.
comes out.
Absolutely. That's absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So you talked a lot about having that support from your medical team and that support and finding people who would listen. And sometimes you do have to kind of shift gears and find a different group of people if there are constraints outside of your control. Carol, what are some other options for folks, or what else might be able to be put in place, or other routes that folks can take?
So I think Michelle raised a great point. It's about communication. It is about being prepared. If you have a child who has medical complexities that require interventions and require care during the school day, you want to be on the same team, and you want to be viewed as, what can we do to ensure that this child is going to have an optimal experience at school and is going to be able to thrive in this environment. And in order to do that, it takes planning. And I can't tell you how many conversations we have at the preschool level or at the pre-K level, getting a school system ready for what the needs of this child will be. And most importantly, I think, and it's something that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, is, the medical complexities are not the child, right? The child is the child, but you have to make sure that what they have is taken care of. It doesn't define them as a person, but it's just something that's built into their day. And we as a team, I'm really fortunate because I do work at a team that very much views like, okay, what can we do to ensure success here? And that means, if I need to go to the school to show a nurse how to apply, how to use an ostomy appliance, I've done that. If we need to do school orders that are very clear and very specific with our team regarding central lines or G-tubes or the cares that need to take place, it's about having conversation with that team. And many times it's nurse talking to nurse, because the other part is, we want them to be invested in this kid, right? We want them to know this child. We want them to know this family. And if they know them and they're invested, they're going to go above and beyond. So once we can create kind of that story and that they can understand who this child is and what their needs are, I find that it's an easier road, right? It's an easier path to follow and to go down. It's not always easy, but again, it's about, as a parent, it's about being organized. It's, as Michelle said, it's about being a team player and saying, okay, what can I do that we can support you so that we can be successful here? And it's about being prepared. You do not want to be going into a kindergarten level and never talking to a school district about what your child's needs are. You want this school district and this community to know your child, because if you walk in the door 2 weeks before school starts, there's the saying, it takes a village. It takes a village, which means you need to be prepared and they need to be prepared. If they're prepared, they're not going to have their hands up saying, we can't do this. But it's really about just having conversations early in the game, having very clear expectations of what those needs are going to be, and then, doing everything that you can so you can partner. And, Michelle makes a great point. As I said, it's about being a team, and sometimes you don't want the family to be the bad guy here, right? You don't want to create like an adversarial role. You want to create an environment where it's great. But if it needs to come down to, these are what the medical needs are of the child, then you need your medical team to be behind you saying, these are what their needs are and these are what we have to do. And we'll have the chops to stand behind you or step in front of you to say, this is what we need in order to be successful.
Carol, I think if I may,
Yeah.
you raised an excellent point about the fact that when I feel I experienced this with Max, when they got to school, or when Max and Nick got to school, they were seen as their medical condition. And, oh, that's the boy who's on TPN or has an IV or whatever. And now it's like totally not. Like, for years, it's been, we just love the Martys, like just love them to death. They're the best. And as long as you can develop that relationship with working as a team, and they can see, and I think of course, I think my kids are the most special in the world, but
Well, they are.
um, they can start to see that and appreciate that too, and that you're not going to fight them about everything, and you kind of have to give and take and compromise here and there, and it's a little bit of a game sometimes, but it does work out in the best situation. It will work out, obviously, for the child psychologically and medically, but medically is the first thing, and that there's no compromise as far as the care level.
Absolutely. And Carol, I know you work mostly with young ones, but if you are comfortable, would you maybe speak at all to how this may translate to a workplace or even like higher education, what that might look like in terms of asking for accommodations?
Sure. And I think you're going to hear this from Max, because I've watched him grow as a little boy into a young man. And it's about advocating, right? It's about self-advocating. And you learn that at a young age. So you learn how to ask for what you need in order for it to work for your schedule. And I think that will carry into adulthood as well. And I think, I've had the opportunity to work with adults, and I think it's really important that you're very clear about what your needs are, what you're willing to share. But I also agree with you. You mentioned, Maisie, about having a team. It's having people there who work with you, who kind of understand this is what it is. You don't have to sing it from the rooftops to everybody. You have you have your posse, you have your people who you trust, and your people who you can share things with. And if they have your back and they understand, I think it's just so much easier than to be going at it alone. And again, in your job, you want to be known for what you do, not for what you have, right? So that carries from, children to adults. You want to be identified as who you are, not what you have. So it's just advocating, and it's about being okay with asking for what you need, and being able to verbalize that. And I think that's something as a child and as a young teenager, I think that's the greatest gift we can teach our patients and families is it's okay to ask for things. It's okay to be very clear about what your wants and needs are, because it actually, as a practitioner, it makes it that much easier to partner with you, because we then have a clear kind of idea of, okay, this is where things are going. And I'm not going to steal Max's thunder, because he's got great ideas, and he talks about those things. So yeah, it's communication, always about communication.
Absolutely. And I think as you get older too, not to pull away from this at all, but as you get older in the workplace, there are certain accommodations that your employer legally has to make. So even if you don't know what the parameters of those accommodations can look like, in order for you to be able to do your job, they have to make reasonable accommodations. So don't be
So
like
human
Carol,
resources would be a huge advocate and a piece to support you, because they do know the letter of the law, right? They know what they have to provide to an employee.
Yeah, HR is a great resource, absolutely. And it is great to have, your team behind you, but sometimes they may be your cheerleader, definitely. So I want to talk a little bit about Max's experience, being hooked up in school. I can't remember who mentioned it, but somebody was talking about doing a presentation to share kind of what to expect in terms of the classmates and the teachers. I can't remember which one of you that was, but
I mean, you can have if you're talking about like a formalized plan, I mean, you have a formalized plan of care. So any child, or in Max's situation, and Max, I'll use you as an example, but there's very clear written instructions as far as what needs are for him in order to safely care for him in the school setting, and also kind of what you need to know in the event of, what if this happens, what do we do? Because life is all about plan B, right? It's always trying to figure out, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have these issues, but you know what? Things happen and life happens. And our greatest goal is to make sure that in those situations, practitioners, nurses, teachers, they know what to do. And for that reason, we have a really in-depth school order that goes to school with every one of our kids in our program. And it is very clear, and it tells you if, you know, if the line breaks, if you have a fever, if we think you're dehydrated, if, you know, fluids, giving even something as simple as having a child who has the ability to carry a water bottle with them all the time, which, you know, you would think would be like not a big deal, but in a school, it's a big deal. Or a kid who has to go to the bathroom and doesn't necessarily want to be in the fray with all of his friends. So we work it out that, you know what, he can go to the nurse's office if he wants to, and he can go to the bathroom whenever he wants to. There's not going to be any of this, I have to raise my hand and get permission from my teacher in order to leave. Things like that. Or it's, you know, we have some kids as they're growing up and, you know, as infants and small children, they weren't necessarily eating a lot, and they have some pretty good oral aversion so that they don't like to eat. But the social piece of it, you know, we've written orders saying, let them sit at the table with their friends. They're not going to eat anything, and we don't want them to eat anything if they don't want to. If this is more of a social thing, so you're not going to be the teacher that's standing over them saying you need to eat your food. Or kids who need to take a little bit longer and say, you know, you're giving them 18 minutes to eat their lunch, but it's going to take this child a lot longer than 18 minutes to get half a sandwich in. So we make those accommodations. And I think the other part that's huge, and Michelle can speak to this as well, it's having a conversation with the parents, right? So we're not just making this stuff up and saying, okay, well, this sounds good. It's about having in-depth conversations about what are your needs, what are your wants, what do we feel like you know, Max would benefit from. And based on that information and based on standards and policies and procedures that we as an institution follow, that's where we get all of our information. And it's very clearly documented. It is very black and white. There's not a lot of gray.
I would say the only gray area comes from the child, because there are all of these instances that you just do not think of, whether you've gone to medical school for a zillion years or you've been a parent of a medical child. Max brought up in one of our meetings, or in one situation in elementary school, I want permission to shut my pump off during a lockdown drill, because I'm afraid if we're huddled together, the sound of my pump will alert a shooter of where we are. I mean, having to live with that, you know, it makes you tear up, but he wanted permission to be able to shut that pump off. And so you don't fit, that's the gray area. You don't think of every single possible situation. And so, but you know, the person who's going through with it does. So those are other things that come up as you go along. And that's where flexibility is important. And the ability, if you have a 504 at school, you can revisit it and say something came up and now Max wants to eat lunch, but you know, he's doing this or he doesn't want to eat anymore. So stop telling him he has to eat something, because there are lunch monitors who don't always know which kids need to be encouraged and aren't eating at home. And so that's a whole different story. Or the kids who can't eat, and I mean, that's a lot on a school to have to deal with too. So communication is super, super important.
Absolutely. And that's why it's important to have that team. So there are those people kind of in each situation who might know on the playground or in the cafeteria. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I know within our own team, so it's not just nursing, it's social work. We have speech language pathologists, we have physicians, we have a whole core group that make up our team, but we all touch different pieces. So we're able to kind of look at, and that's what you want. You want to make sure that you're able to look at every piece. And you know, when Max was, you know, in kindergarten, it was really important that he have a one-to-one nurse. Max, you can talk about this. Would you want a one-to-one nurse now? No, exactly. So those needs all completely change. And I mean, I would love to hear kind of your perspective on that and what it's like for you, like to go from a kid who had a nurse with him all the time and doing all these things to like now being like, I want to be with my buddies. I don't want this nurse around.
Talk about fifth
So
grade.
in 5th grade, we did get a one-on-one nurse in the transition to middle school. We got a one-on-one nurse for the middle school, and I'm just gonna say it, she was slightly weird. She was overprotective. She would follow me around, and one time I remember I got hooked up and I went and I was at my locker with my friend and I was talking to my friends, and then I feel something on my backpack and I turn around and her head is on my backpack because she wasn't sure if she started the pump, so she's listening for it. So it's stuff like that that made me then like not really want one, and we started making accommodations with my doctors so that I wouldn't have to need one in school all that much.
That's a
And
really
that was stuff I wanted him to have a nurse. We just moved from a small elementary school to a huge middle school in 5th grade. And I said, absolutely, Max, you have to have someone walking you to class, doing. And he came home and said, Mom, I was at my locker with my friends and she had her ear up against my backpack. And, you know, then I have to take that into account and say, all right, well, that is not very good for you socially. And he advocated to say, I want to put a different plan into place and have it so that I don't have to be walked to class and that I know if the pump is going or not. And it took us putting some trust in Max and knowing that he's mature enough and been dealing with this long enough that his doctors have been talking to him enough that he knows what, you know, is important and what's not important to communicate. And that's a huge part of it too, is having practitioners who talk to the kids, which was shocking to me. But around 9 years old, they started talking directly to him about his care. And it has been the best thing because that's the only way he knows, you know, what's possible and what he can ask for and feels comfortable talking to doctors. So
Yeah, and that trust, like, you know, Max, you have been honest about how you feel and your care and, you know, all of that management piece. And so that has, you know, helped build that trust too. Absolutely. So Max, you like were hooked up at school for a while. Do you still get hooked up at school?
No, I don't.
No.
Not anymore.
Okay. So what changed? How did you go about changing that?
So, like with all the stories, like I just told you about the nurse, it wasn't easy getting hooked up at school. So then at one of the Make-A-Wish meetings, I did meet another friend who had the same thing as me, except he did his hydration, he said after school. And I said, hey, that seems perfect for me. So I asked Mom to talk to all of the doctors and see if I could get that. So we started making a few changes to having it after school. And then eventually I realized I could talk to them and get a change if I wanted. So eventually that went all the way to making a compromise so I didn't have to have hydration during the day at all.
but what was the compromise?
But the compromise for that was I would have to have an extra hour of TPN overnight, but that was 100% worth it for me.
Yeah, and we've talked like in our, you know, meetings before this, we've talked a lot about quality of life, right? And how those little changes can make things like hanging out with your friends a lot easier without your nurse right beside you, right? That's awesome. That's amazing. So what we talked a little bit too about what other adaptations you've made just to kind of improve that quality of life and make things a little bit simpler. These are more central line than feeding tube, but I think just knowing that options are out there is important. What are some things that you've started using or doing that make life easier?
So almost immediately, one of the changes we made, which a lot of people don't know about, is usually at hospitals you see kids with IV poles walking around, and a lot of people think, hey, I have to have an IV pole at home, but you don't have to have that. Really early on, I got a backpack for mine, and we started trying out different things. First, I had a rolling backpack. It was too heavy to carry. And then the rolling backpack was tricky going up the stairs, so I went back to a carrying backpack, but it's also much easier than the other option, which would have been an IV pole that I had to drag around and carry everywhere. And then another change we made was for the tubing for my backpack, we had usually a straight cord of tubing, so I couldn't go very far because you can't stretch that. So then we made an adaptation where I had a spiral tubing, like a slinky, where I could in fact move far and it would stretch out. So I could move around without having to pick my backpack up to like go pick up the remote off the table, like small stuff like that.
That's awesome. And I think you're right. Like, I think some people who might be new to this or still kind of making those adjustments and finding what works for them. I think to someone who's been doing it their whole life, like that seems, that's just how we've done it. But it took you, a while to figure those things out, just like it would for anyone. So I appreciate you sharing those things. I was gonna ask, why, so we talked a little bit also about why you decided to make that choice, and advocating for changing your infusion schedule. How does it feel? And you don't have to answer this if you don't want, it's kind of feely. How does it feel being, or how did it feel being hooked up kind of in a social situation or around your friends? And I guess how might somebody feel if they're in that situation for the first time?
So it wasn't that bad lately. It was mostly when I was young in kindergarten, not a lot of kids knew about it, and I was already feeling awkward about it first time I went to school. So when kids started asking me about it, they were just curious, but they didn't know how that made me feel awkward and weird. And that weird feeling kind of stayed with me throughout. So then kids, as you grow old, don't really say anything to you, but for some kids there's just this feeling of being the odd one out that doesn't always sit right. So I just made the adaptation, and it's so much better now.
Do you have any friends that you do feel comfortable being hooked up around?
Yeah, some of my good friends from early middle school, elementary school, who know what it is and don't care at all about it.
That's awesome. Cool. I'm really like, I personally am really proud of you for advocating. Like, that's hard. That's really hard. Yeah, you've done great. Carol, do you have anything else to add in terms of who those key players might be? Any resources that might be accessible for folks who have to navigate this? Kind of what a good starting point might be?
I think talking to your team first and foremost, there are great resources out there, and a great team will recognize what resources either they belong to them, or they've created them, or they've found them, and there are like incredible resources. One resource which I think is great, and we're really looking at it now as an institution, is in Toronto, the Hospital for Sick Kids. They did this program on kind of school readiness, and they did YouTube videos, and they really kind of talked about like how to talk to your friends, how to talk to the teachers. And I think that part, again, starting at an early age, it's really important to normalize as much as you can. And again, it's looking at who the person is, not what they have, but also making it just part of the day, and kind of just putting the normalcy to it and not making it something bigger than it has to be. I think sometimes, parents will tell me that they hit roadblocks. Just, as Michelle said, her first experience with the school district was, no, we can't do that, or, oh, he doesn't need that, and they're making decisions based on, a budget, or based on, not full information. And I think having a team that can communicate initially, and can be there as a support. And it's funny because I think about, as we said, I think about Max, who in kindergarten, we were fighting to get him a nurse. But, then you've had a kid who's had a nurse, and all of a sudden now in 5th grade, you're saying he doesn't need the nurse anymore. And the schools are like, nope, we're not comfortable with that. We want to
Yeah.
keep the nurse. And we're like, well, we have to work through that. And so Michelle's shaking her head saying, yep, I totally
That's a
have it.
really, yeah, that's a really good point, because I went in like with guns blazing about this is life or death and he could die and blah, blah, like trying to scare them to death about how important it was for his care, and they just weren't understanding. And I was new to this. I mean, he was 4, now he's almost 14, so it's much later. But I was always terrified, and I wanted them to be just as terrified and care for him. And then you grow older and you get more comfortable with it. As I've said, once your child can start to explain that their bellyache feels like they're going to throw up, or it feels like a sharp pain, or it feels like, it makes a world of difference. So some of that anxiety comes down because it's not just screaming and crying baby and you don't know what's happening. So they can communicate to you, and you're getting more comfortable. And then you have to say to the school, okay, now you can back off. And they say, oh, so is he better? And you say, no, nothing's changed medically. He's exactly the same. And they kind of look at you like, well, then what was going on before? What's going on now? And it's, you know, unless you have an amazing team and understanding, and I find nurses in general get it,
Right.
as long as they're not being, you know, handcuffed by a budget or a union or something like that. They're kind, compassionate people who want to take care of kids. But they'll understand. And our nurses have helped Max become more independent, where, you know, we've said we actually are transitioning now to having him be a little more independent in things that we used to want you to do. So now can we ask you to not do everything he wants you to do? So it was kind of confusing for a little while, but they slowly got it and they realized this was kind of a transition plan to get him more independent. So there's a lot that goes into it. And it is, like you said, it's interesting because it's very hard at the beginning because you're so fierce about what you need, and then you back off when they get older. And it's because they need to become more independent, not because the situation is better, quote unquote.
Right.
So it does, again, comes back to communication. And
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
that's why it's so important to continue to evaluate too, because
Mhm.
even, you know, as folks change developmentally, but also in their medical situation, sometimes things, you know, it's not totally linear. Sometimes things improve in one area and, you know, digress in another area, regress. And we have to constantly be kind of adjusting and adapting. And it's the same in the workplace too. You know, maybe one accommodation worked for a little while, but you need something a little bit more, or you know, don't necessarily need that one anymore, but you need something else in place. And so I think what you guys had said earlier about, you know, asking for what you need, because they won't know unless you ask. And that's, you know, in a school, in a work setting, in a higher education setting, you don't know what's possible unless you ask. So, and continue to check back and see if it's working. Definitely.
Well, and I think one thing that COVID has taught us is that, you know, things are not black and white, right? That we can live outside the box and we can make accommodations. And if you had said that, you know, 5 years ago that we would actually have a viable telemedicine, telehealth program, I would have laughed. And you know what? It's allowed people to have the flexibility. And when I think of older people in the workforce, you know, maybe you have the flexibility so that you can work into your work plan that, you know what, I have a laptop, I can get my job done, I can do what I need to do, and I can be totally, you know, outside the box, available to you and get what needs to be done. But maybe it's at a little bit different time frame, right? Maybe it's because today I'm off and I'm not going to be leaving the house and I need to be able to work remotely today, but still get the job done. And I think having the technology and kind of the ability to advocate for that, I think is huge.
Carol, to that point, that's also applicable with the schools with COVID. Once they went back to in-person learning here, they
Mhm.
removed all accessibility to remote learning because the teachers couldn't do it. They couldn't handle it anymore. They were burnt out. They couldn't access who's home today, who's not, who's this, who's that. So we advocated that, okay, Max and Nick are going to be different. And if they need remote learning, we know you can do it. And if they're in the hospital for a week, we don't want them missing a week of school. And they were able to say, okay, we understand that's a different situation than a child who's, you know, just home with the sniffles or whose family is in Turks and Caicos.
Right.
So that was an important thing to advocate to. Same thing as working from home. We can say similar.
Right.
And that brings up a great point too, in terms of having a contingency plan if you are out of work or school for a long time. For adults, there's, you know, short-term disability, you know, medical leave, those sorts of things. And for students, having the ability to do work from the hospital, technology has improved. I remember back in my day, my classmates had to coordinate and bring me my schoolwork in the hospital. So to be able to have that accommodation is a great leap forward. Absolutely. Um, Max, I have a question for you. So you and I talked a little bit at the beginning of all of this, and we talked about how maybe being diagnosed or getting a tube later in life might be different than being born with one, and that's, or not born with one, but knowing or having one from a really young age. What would you tell someone who is maybe just getting a tube for the first time, whether they're a kid or a grown up, and this might be a new experience for them? What advice would you give them?
I would say like me, you're gonna get used to it and just be open to changes, advocate for yourself if you need, and be open to compromises because all of that will make it all just a little bit easier if you needed it.
That's awesome. Michelle, what advice would you give a parent of a kiddo who is navigating life with a tube or multiple tubes?
I remember when Max was inpatient, when he was born, he was inpatient for 19 months straight after he was born, and we were ready to take him home. And I said, there's no way I can take home a child on TPN. This makes no sense. This is something you only do in a hospital. I don't even understand how this is going to work. To me, it was just such a foreign concept. And they had me speak with another parent who said, it's going to become normal to you. And I looked at her like she had 4 heads. And I was like, this is not normal. What do you mean it's going to become normal? And it is just crazy because it does become normal. And it's just like when we asked the school districts to look at beyond the medical devices at the beginning of having a child diagnosed, you think of all the medical and the what if and whatever. And then as they grow, you see how much more there is to them. And obviously, but it's kind of hard to explain, but it just becomes something, and I think medical parents understand it the best. It's just a certain pride that you have over your children, and just I learned more from Max than I learned from anybody, I mean, than I can ever teach him, I think. And it does become normal. It's not, you're gonna have bad days. I remember thinking it's not fair and why is this happening? And it's normal to grieve, you know, certain things, and you have to acknowledge that. And therapy is a wonderful thing, and don't be afraid of that. And it puts a lot of strain on your relationships. And there's so many bumps in the road, but at the end of the day, if you get the right support in place, if you're not afraid to ask for help, even if it's just with the laundry, because you think no one could possibly help me with TPN, well, they could get you groceries. It was those kinds of things I didn't realize young, or when we first had the boys, that I wish I could go back and say I should have asked for more help in those areas. And then it does become, and you get a great medical team behind you, and everything feels a lot safer and a lot better, and there's a lot more hope. So it does all work out.
Yeah, and it's, you raise a good point too, and it's about having your own village, right? So,
Yeah.
there are great organizations, Oley being one of them.
Mm-hmm.
There are great, family sites. There are, great opportunities for people to connect with one another who honestly can say, I know what you're going through, and yep, I've been there. And I think to have somebody else to say, you're not crazy, this is normal, this is how you're going to feel, and not walking down that road. But one of the first things that I would always say and continue to say to families is, your first week at home, you're going to feel like your head's going to explode. You're going to have more supplies and things than you know what to do with. And all you can do is breathe. And I promise you, we're going to talk in 2 weeks and it's going to be okay. But just kind of go with it, breathe, and just kind of embrace the whole experience, because knowing it will get easier.
And that's another thing, is that when the boys were born, there wasn't Facebook yet.
Right.
So I don't know how, it was very isolating feeling. And then once Facebook came along, I see for the parents of younger kids now, how helpful, even for me still, how helpful it is to have that resource of Facebook groups that are incredibly supportive and incredible. The parents just want, because when you have children with medical needs, you just want the next parents to have it easier. You don't want them to have to recreate the wheel or to have to figure this whole thing out from scratch. If you've been through something, share it. Don't give medical advice, but share what your experience was, so then they can, you know, from organizing supplies, you know, down to traveling and all of that. There's been a lot of wonderful ways to get support, which is fantastic.
Yeah, the number of resources are just growing, and there
Mhm.
are organizations out there that help folks find jobs that are specifically remote. And there are organizations that are working to navigate policies and make sure that folks are able to access the accommodations that they need. So I think, you know, bringing it back to kind of once you get to a point where you feel like you can be at school, continue, you know, go back to work, find something that fits this new normal. There are a ton of resources out there
Yeah.
to help you navigate that change as well, and just continue to you know, we always say find that new normal,
Yeah.
sort of in COVID times, but in life too. It's never just, you know, normal doesn't have to look just one way. Absolutely. Oh, Carol, I wanted to ask you, what advice, and I don't want, you know, to put you on the spot in terms of speaking for the whole medical community, but I will. Um, but what advice would you give to medical providers or members of a medical team who might be supporting a child in going back to school, or an older person going to work? Like what might they need from a medical provider, and how can they offer support?
So as a medical provider or institution, I think it's know your patient, know your family, and ask. I think that's probably the greatest gift that you can give, is to partner with your patients and their families, because if you don't ask what they need, you don't know what they need. So it's really important about, what can I do to support you? What is the best thing? Because, you know, what's the best thing that we can do so that you can be successful? And it's listening. You know, for like Max, it was like, I don't want to be hooked up. I don't want to be hooked up during the day. So, okay, how do we make that work? Because obviously, you know, we have to make sure that medically things are good and safe and stable, obviously. But you know, there's some wiggle room. And I think you don't know what you can have if you don't ask for it. And you don't know what people want if you don't ask them. So I think having them, you know, I'm really proud of our team and the fact that it is a partnership. And we've always said it, you know, you take a role. And as Michelle said, you know what, we start looking at children who are transitioning, you know, as young as 9 years old, saying, you know, what do you want? How's it going for you? So that, you know, there's definitely kind of a delineation of roles, right? So that you really start looking at the person. And, you know, as a provider, I think that's probably the greatest gift that you can give to your patients and their families, is to really look at them as a person, look at them as a unit, and ask them, what do you need? What's important to you? What things can we work through so that you can be successful in your quality of life and your life is better? What can we do? Because it's not black and white. There's so many versions of gray, right? So many shades. So, but it's asking what they need. And again, what does it come down to? It's about communication. It's about honesty. It's just about having that relationship.
And Maisie, sorry, but to say go back to what you were saying about what would you say to a new parent in this situation, to Carol's point, I didn't know that I could ask for anything. I thought it was black and white, and this is the diagnosis, this is the plan. And back then, 14 years ago, it's a lot different than it is now, where family-centered care is becoming a lot more the norm. But I was raised that doctors went to medical school for a reason, and they had the answers. And who was I to question? I didn't go to medical school. And it's totally flipped. As a parent, you need to know that you can ask questions. You can ask for things for your child that may seem crazy, but you don't know until you ask. And I've been surprised at, I mean, down from, he doesn't want to change into a gown before going into surgery. you know what? You don't have to. I have friends whose kids go in for their tonsils out and they're petrified about putting on the gown, and I'll tell them over the phone, and it's a tonsil surgery. I say, they don't have to put the gown on. Here's a secret. And they're like, what? And I'm like, it's little things like that that parents don't know, that you can give your child control where they can get control. Make them have, allow them to have choices where they can have choices. And there's a lot more areas for that than we realize as parents, because we're thinking the black and white and the extremes and the worst case scenario versus the best prognosis. And we're not thinking of the little things, like give them the whole roll of stickers. Like, it's okay. I had a friend come into the hospital and she stole a roll of stickers from Max, and I was mortified. And the nurse was like, shh, I won't tell anyone. And I was like, oh, like I thought we're going to get arrested. But those little things make a huge difference. And as a parent, I think I was always such a rule follower growing up that I just didn't think I was, allowed to ask those questions. And having a team that is open to, being flexible with that. And like I said, nurses are amazing because they'll usually give you whatever you want. But I think new parents need to know that they should not feel bad asking questions, and you're not disrespecting a surgeon if you question his technique because you research something different.
Right.
A good surgeon will appreciate the fact that you are looking into that as a parent. And I've had surgeons who have been defensive, and that's when I say, okay, bye-bye. We're not going to use you. And you have a lot more control than you think you do. So,
yeah.
And I think healthcare is really switched to, it's consumer based. You know what?
Yeah.
People have choices. And I think, don't ever forget that you're a consumer. So you absolutely have the right to ask the questions and to make sure that you are comfortable with the answers. And if you're not comfortable with the answers, you get to make that call.
Yeah. And I think, Michelle, you're talking about new parents, but I think new patients too, who might be new to this world of medicine and trying to figure out, what their rights are, where that wiggle room is. Can I go back to work? Can I go back to school? What does that look like? And they may not know even where to start. And so I think finding, that one person on your team or maybe elsewhere who can kind of give you a leg up on some of those resources that Carol mentioned, or having that support group that they attend, or that social media group where they can get these ideas, I think is so important. So I really appreciate you sharing that insight. Absolutely. Any final thoughts or additional insight or words of wisdom that we want to share with our viewers?
No.
Come on, Max.
All right. So I am thinking, unfortunately, we aren't able to do this live because Max is a very busy man and we wanted to accommodate his schedule. There may be some questions that roll in, so I will do my best to get those to Michelle, Max, and Carol and try to get some answers back to folks. We will also have some other events during Feeding Tube Awareness Week where we'll have support groups, we'll have a social hour, and a couple of other things listed on our website. But I just want to thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom, your time, your energy, your Wednesday evening. I just am so appreciative. And I think our viewers who watch this will be as well. So if we don't have any additional thoughts, I think we can sign off.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thank
letting us
you.
be here.
Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Take care.
So that just about concludes our webinar. There were some excellent questions posted in the Q&A section, so I will forward those along and I will respond to our registration list with the answer so everybody can see what they have to say. Thank you again, Carol, for logging on. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I won't keep you all. But that is it. So we do have some more Feeding Tube Awareness Week events throughout the week. We have a couple of our support groups. So check out our website for additional resources. And I did put some in the chat in terms of disclosure was something that was brought up, as well as the school readiness packet that Carol mentioned. So with that, we are going to sign off. Thank you all so much for attending. It was a pleasure to have you all.